Hey everybody, this is a piece from the new volume Marx Key Concepts, edited by Riccardo Bellifiore and Tommaso Ridolfi Riva. The piece that I'm reading is by Sebastian Taccola, It's titled Primitive Accumulation. So, Section 1. Primitive accumulation as a starting point. The chapter on primitive accumulation begins with an extraordinary example of Marx's typical anti-bourgeois irony, a literary style that often appears in Capital and that probably owes much to Shakespeare, Goethe, and mostly Heine. For an analysis of the influence that literature had on the formation of Marx's theoretical and political thought, see Power, 1976. People know Shakespeare, Goethe, and Heine. Heine is I believe a German Jewish poet. I think he's Jewish, but a German Jewish poet that was like contemporaneous with Marx. I think he died before Marx did, but now I have to look it up. Now I'm sorry. But yeah, he was a poet from 19th century Germany. I think he's associated with a certain type of romanticism, but I'm not sure. Quote, this primitive accumulation, this is Marx, quote, this primitive accumulation, ursprüngliche Accumulation, end bracket, plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell on the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it is told as an anecdote of the past. In times long gone by, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all frugal elite. The others, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. The legend of theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread in the sweat of his brow. But the history of economic original sin, reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Never mind. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except his own skins. End quote. Marx, 1867, Capital. Thus, primitive accumulation is the historical background of the constitution of the bourgeois social relations. Marx wants to unmask the apologetic and idyllic vision proposed by political economy, which makes of the bourgeoisie a class of virtuous men and of the proletarians, or more generally, of the poorer people, a class of lazy squanderers. Through the category of, quote, primitive accumulation, end quote, Marx wants to unmask that the ways that lead to the capitalist mode of production are based on methods that, quote, are anything but idyllic, end quote. Marx, 1867, Capital. Therefore, there is a primitive accumulation that precedes the accumulation sans phrase and distinguishes itself from accumulation sans phrase insofar as it is, quote, an accumulation not the result of the capitalist mode of production, but the capitalist mode of production's starting point, end quote. Marx, 1867, Capital. Posing the bourgeois categories at the beginning of history, the classical political economy naturalizes the capitalistic social relations and, thus, makes them eternal. But according to Marx, money, means of production and of subsistence, cannot always be considered subspecie capitalistica. Money, means of production and of subsistence, need to be transformed into capital. The necessary presupposition of such a transformation is the accomplishment of the process of separation between the worker and the worker's conditions of labor. Historically speaking, this process of separation between the worker and the worker's conditions of labor, that leads to the genesis of the modern free worker, who has nothing to sell but his labor power. That is, James Stewart, not James Stewart of It's a Wonderful Life, but James Stewart, the economist, quote, free hands, end quote. One second. Yeah, I just want to read James Stewart's little Wikipedia intro. James Stewart, 3rd Baronet of Goodtrees and 7th Baronet of Coltness, lived from 1712 to 1780, and was also known as Sir James Stewart Denham, and Sir James Denham Stewart was a prominent Scottish Jacobite and author of, quote, probably the first systematic treatise written in English about economics, end quote, and the first book in English with, quote, political economy, end quote, in the title. Wow. James Stewart assumed the surname of Denham later in life. James Stewart inherited his cousin's baronetcy of Coltness in 1773. Back to the text. In this perspective, Marx presents a more specific definition of primitive accumulation. Quote, the process, therefore, that clears the way for the capitalist system can be none other than the process which takes away from the laborer the possession of his means of production, a process that transforms on the one hand the social means of subsistence and of production into capital, on the other the immediate producers into wage laborers. The so-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. It appears as primitive because it forms the prehistoric stage of capital and of the mode of production corresponding with the stage of capital. End quote, Marx, 1867. Here Marx highlights the historical side of primitive accumulation as a history of the expropriation of the workers' conditions of production and of the constitution of those historically determined social relations that enable capitalist accumulation through the exploitation of the labor power. The result is that in the capitalist society, the worker is no more immediately dependent on personal power relationships, as happened in the pre-capitalist forms of relations of production, such as ancient slavery or feudal serfdom, but is enslaved by capital in a more mediated and mystified way. Section 2. British primitive accumulation, a historical case. Marx finds the illustrative case of primitive accumulation in modern England. He outlines the plural strategies that brought to the dissolution of feudal relations and to the creation of the ex lege proletariat in some central passages of the chapters concerning primitive accumulation. What the hell does ex lege mean? Ex lege, matter of law. It is possible to sum up these strategies in a few points. 1. The redefinition of the property rights over the lands, a process that, through the expropriation of the ecclesiastical and public property, and of the yeomen's lands, and the privatization of communal property through the Enclosures Acts, led to the birth of modern private property. 2. The redefinition of the property rights over the means of production through the phenomenon of the clearing of the estates, that is, peasants forced to leave their lands and their means of production as well. 3. A brutal legislation to discipline the expropriated so that they were forced to accept low wages and to conform to the coercive market laws. 4. The violent creation of a home market that, going hand in hand with brutal colonialism and using means such as public debt and protectionism, posed the presuppositions for the capitalist dynamics to evolve on a global, systematic, and perpetual scale. Footnote. Marx dedicates chapter 33, The Modern Theory of Colonization, to an analysis of the colonialism. It is worth noting that for Marx, the examination of modern phenomena such as colonialism cannot exist without a synchronic and systematic critical theory of capitalist society. That is, without having first understood the structural conditions according to which, quote, capital is not a thing but a social relation between persons established by the instrumentality of things, end quote. Marx, 1867. End footnote. 5. The transformation of the money capital accumulated as loan capital and commercial capital into industrial capital through the dissolution of the feudal bonds and the appropriation of the means of production by the rising bourgeoisie. Footnote. It is worth noting that Maurice Dobbs' Studies in the Development of Capitalism is probably one of the first works that explicitly follows the strategies of primitive accumulation outlined by Marx in order to give a historical account of the growth of proletariat between the 16th and 18th centuries. End footnote. In all of these passages, Marx highlights that, quote, force, end quote, Gewalt, is an essential means for the realization of such strategies. Footnote. The huge semantic spectrum evoked by the German term Gewalt can hardly be translated in English. It means at the same time force, violence, power. This leads many interpreters to state that the word Gewalt has an immanent ambiguity. In this perspective, for example, Etienne Balibar has written, quote, in German, the language in which Marx, Engels, and the first Marxists wrote, the word Gewalt has a more extensive meaning than Gewalt's, quote, equivalents, end quote, in other European languages. Violence, or violenza, or pouvoir, poter, power. Seen in this way, quote, from the outside, end quote, the term Gewalt thus contains an intrinsic ambiguity. Gewalt refers at the same time to the negation of law or justice and to law and justice's realization or the assumption of responsibility for them by an institution, generally the state, end quote. Etienne Balibar, 2009. Maximiliano Tamba, analyzing this passage by Balibar and proposing an interpretation that is shared in this chapter, stated, quote, dividing Gewalt into, quote, power and, quote, violence, one must not think of two sides of violence, the institutional and the anti-institutional, because much apparently extra-legal violence ends up written into the institutional record. Furthermore, a great deal of state violence, which is denounced as illegitimate, is of rather vital importance for maintaining the state machinery. In this ambivalence is hidden the violent character of law, that violence that funds the state and preserves the state, end quote. Massimiliano Tamba, 2009. End footnote. In the Marxian presentation, force becomes a crucial category to read the whole history of modern Europe in a critical way, and to sketch a sort of counter-history of the genesis of the present social relations. Quote, the different momenta of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now, more or less in chronological order, particularly over Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. In England, at the end of the 17th century, they arrive at a systematical combination embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. These methods depend in part on brute force, e.g. the colonial system, but they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society, to hasten, hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with the new society, a new society. Force is itself an economic power, end quote. Marx. An economic power that, with the force of the whip and of the law, realizes, quote, the artificial product of modern society, end quote, which consists, on the one hand, in the foundation of a new anthropological standard, namely the owner individual, and on the other hand, in the birth of the, quote, eternal laws of nature, end quote, quote, the, quote, eternal laws of nature, end quote, of the capitalist mode of production, end quote. Marx, Capital. New section. Section 3. The systematic character of primitive accumulation. These are the methods of primitive accumulation as a leveler of the capitalistic social relations and the process of dissolution of the feudal society. Footnote. Here I cannot deal with the questions concerning the historical trajectories of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, questions that gave rise to a debate known as the transition debate or the Dobbs-Sweezy debate. Since it followed the publication of the studies on the development of capitalism by Maurice Dobb and the critical review dedicated to it by Paul Sweezy. For a complete collection of the articles composing the debate, see Aston and Philpin. Anyway, it is important to underline that in this debate, primitive accumulation played a marginal role, since the scholars who took part in it, in addition to Dobb and Sweezy, also H.K. Takahashi, R. Hilton, Christopher Hill, Henri Lefebvre, G. Procasi, J. Marrington, Eric Hobsbawm, focused especially on some chapters from Capital Volume 3, namely Chapter 20, quote, historical facts about merchants' capital, end quote, and Chapter 36, quote, pre-capitalist relationships, end quote, Chapter 47, quote, the genesis of capitalist ground rent, end quote. For a reconstruction of the whole debate, see Hilton, 1978. Similar issues had been at the center of a later debate known as the Brenner debate, opened by the article Agrarian Class Structure and Economic Development in Pre-Industrial Europe by the Marxist historian Robert Brenner. But if the Dobbs-Sweezy debate was an intra-Marxist debate, the Brenner debate also involved non-Marxist scholars and evoked a much more complex range of themes concerning the European long-term economic development. For a complete collection of the articles composing the debate, see Ashton Philippin, 1987. For a more recent and theoretically brilliant overview from a Marxist perspective on issues concerning the origin of capitalism, see Mason's Wood, 2002. That book is theoretically brilliant and is on this YouTube channel, because I only pick the coolest stuff in the world. End footnote. In this horizon, it is possible to identify founding processes of the capitalist mode of production in a diachronic perspective, which can help to shed light on the historical differences existing between the capitalist and the pre-capitalist modes of production, and thus to lay the basis for the elaboration of a prehistory of the bourgeois society. The antediluvian character of primitive accumulation is undeniable, but at the same time it is not the only one. If we consider only the antediluvian side of primitive accumulation, we remove primitive accumulation's processual nature, reducing primitive accumulation to a historical phenomenon which occurred once in history, and, moreover, we would run the risk of falling back into those old interpretations that attributed to Marx a vision of history identifiable as a simple and mechanical succession of modes of production founded in primis on the abstract concept of progress. Rather, primitive accumulation is a crucial moment of the capitalist system that synchronically realizes itself within the dynamic that characterizes the whole capitalist reproduction. Synchronic. It's like, like synchronistic swimming is like things happening at the same time. Usually think of like synchronic meaning like the systematic presentation as opposed to like a historical presentation, but I'm not sure. Yeah, synchronic, occurring or existing at the same time. Definition of synchronic, adjective, occurring or existing at the same time or having the same period of phase. Synonym, synchronical, diachronic, synchronous, coetaneous, coeval, contemporaneous. Yeah, so like, like for instance, like I have pieces on here from Christopher J. Author and other people that are associated with value form analysis, and one of the things that is like important to those people is the critique of the conception of capital put forward by by Kautsky, and to some extent by Engels as well. That capital, especially, is a historical piece that kind of is like a gloss on the grand sweep of like historical processes, as opposed to a systematic presentation of the necessary features of a capitalist society in their ideal average, or whatever, the quote ideal average, right? So synchronic, I think, is kind of like in that vein. I mean, it's easy to get tripped up by these words, at least easy for me. I mean, maybe if you have more theoretical brilliance than I do, which I just don't know how that's possible. Yeah, the synchronous part can trip you up. I think I don't know if maybe like the synchronic thing is like also part of like, I don't know, I think the words like synchronism and shit like that are like important in like Althusserian Marxism, which I'm not particularly interested in, but I'm also pretty ignorant of, so maybe I'll read Althusser's For Capital, or not For Capital, Reading Capital one day. Okay, so back to the text. Where am I? Rather, primitive accumulation is a crucial moment of the capitalist system that synchronically realizes itself within the dynamic that characterizes the whole capitalist reproduction. In fact, as Marx also stated in the Grundrisse, capital, to achieve its perpetual reproduction, needs at the same time the reproduction of those conditions that opens it to new spatial temporal margins of accumulation. Once the fundamental separation between the worker and the means of production is presupposed, quote, the production process can only produce it anew, reproduce it, and reproduce it on an expanded scale, end quote. Marx, 1857-58. That's a Grundrisse era. So I'm assuming that's from the Grundrisse. That is why the tendency to create a world market is immanent to capital. Nowadays, many Marxist scholars, following a thesis originally proposed by Rosa Luxemburg, think that it is necessary to highlight the perpetual character of primitive accumulation in order to understand phenomena such as imperialism, underdevelopment, geopolitics, reproductive and conflicting temporalities of the capitalist society, and so on. Footnote. The following passage from The Accumulation of Capital, the book by Rosa Luxemburg, is paradigmatic. Accumulation, with accumulation's spasmodic expansion, can no more wait for and be content with a natural internal disintegration of non-capitalist formations and their transition to commodity economy than it can wait for and be content with the natural increase of the working population. Force is the only solution open to capital. The accumulation of capital, seen as a historical process, employs force as a permanent weapon, not only at its genesis, but further on down to the present day. End quote, Rosa Luxemburg. End footnote. Among them, it is worth mentioning at least David Harvey, who, to erase the prehistoric character of primitive accumulation, coined the notion of, quote, accumulation by dispossession, end quote, in order to propose a critical inquiry into some recent phenomenon such as gentrification, privatization of commons, commodification and privatization of public assets, and so on. Footnote. Accumulation by dispossession is a topic that is present in many of Harvey's works. See, for example, Harvey 2003, 2006, 2010, and 2014. Back to the text. End footnote. Accordingly, the crucial role that these processes have in the reproduction and the expansion of the capitalistic social relations on a global scale, acknowledging the crucial role that these processes have in the reproduction and expansion of the capitalistic social relations on a global scale, David Harvey also highlights the political potentiality that could be opened by articulating in a productive way the socio-political conflicts given on only apparently independent or residual grounds. In these processes, characteristic and still current expressions of primitive accumulation, the economic and the political are deeply interrelated in a dialectical way. Footnote. In this sense, two passages in which Marx talks about public debt and protectionism as two political economic strategies intelligible within the theoretical framework of the primitive accumulation appear very interesting, mostly nowadays. Quote, the public debt becomes one of the most powerful levers of primitive accumulation. As with the stroke of an enchanter's wand, public debt endows barren money with the power of breeding and thus turns barren money into capital, without the necessity of its exposing itself to the troubles and risks inseparable from its employment in industry or even in usury. The national debt has given rise to joint stock companies, to dealings in negotiable effects of all kind, and to agitate, what that means, in a word, to stock exchange, gambling, and the modern bankocracy. End quote. Marx. Agiotage is a business of exchanging currencies, speculating, dealing in stock exchange and securities of foreign exchange. Anyway, end quote. Marx, 1867, Capital. Quote, the system of production was an artificial means of manufacturing manufacturers, of expropriating independent laborers, of capitalizing the national means of production and subsistence, of forcibly abbreviating the transition from the medieval to the modern mode of production, end quote. Marx. End footnote. Let me reread the last sentence that I wrote. In these processes, characteristic and still current expressions of the primitive accumulation, the economic and the political are deeply interrelated in a dialectical way. For Marx, the Gewalt is a, quote, as we said before, was force or violence or power or something like that, is a, quote, extra economic force, end quote, and a, quote, economic power, end quote. Marx, 1867, Capital. At the same time, their relation cannot be reduced to a linear and deterministic one. In the totality of the capitalistic society, the political cannot exist without the economic and vice versa. A totality, quote, concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse, end quote. Marx, identifiable with those reproductive processes of a historically determined mode of production, whose immanent tendency is to spread on a global scale according to plural spatial temporal coordinates. Keeping in mind these plural spaces and times, it's important to understand why in capitalism a non-contemporaneity, for example, according to Samir Amin, the underdevelopment, coexists with a contemporaneity identifiable with the most developed countries. Capital aims at synchronizing these plural and conflicting temporalities thanks to the economic and extra-economic force of the state. Footnote. Relations between the formation of the, quote, developed, end quote, or advanced world, the center, and those of the, quote, underdeveloped, end quote, world, the periphery, are affected by transfers of value, and these constitute the essence of the problem of accumulation on a world scale. When the capitalist mode of production enters into relations with pre-capitalist modes of production and subjects these pre-capitalist modes of production to itself, transfers of value take place from the pre-capitalist to the capitalist formations as a result of the mechanisms of primitive accumulation. These mechanisms do not belong only to the prehistory of capitalism, they are contemporary as well. It is these forms of primitive accumulation, modified but persistent, to the advantage of the center, that form the domain of the theory of accumulation on a world scale. End footnote. Thus, in the synchronic moment, we can include the tendency of the capitalistic process to posit the capitalistic process's own presuppositions, that is, to form determine the other, what it finds beyond its limits, subspecie capitalistica. As many authors have already shown, capitalistic temporalities are essentially conflicting. Counter-temporalities, often posed by capital itself and capital's evolutionary spiral-like movement, immediately contrast the temporality of capital and capital's process of accumulation, hence producing a tension between different strata of time. 2 footnotes here. The first footnote says, I take the image of the, quote, spiral-like movement, end quote, of capital from David Harvey. The next footnote says, see Tomba 2012 about time. It's Maximiliano Tomba's recent work is about time and temporality and shit like that. Here Tomba, following other authors such as Daniel Ben Said, consider the conflict between different temporalities as a pivotal element in the construction of a Marxian theory of political praxis. End footnote. In this horizon, the bourgeois society no longer appears as a static object of analysis, but as an organism whose physiology is intelligible from the point of view of the antagonisms, conflicts, and contradictions that take place in it. Footnote. This self-contradictory nature of capital is an essential feature of the capitalistic physiology, and a concept that, from a theoretical standpoint, sheds light on the specific differences existing between the pre-capitalist and capitalist modes of production. Self-moving and self-sublating contradiction constitutes a fundamental form determination of capital. See Marx Grundrisse and Calabi, 1975. End footnote. In this perspective, primitive accumulation reveals itself as a category that is able to unveil these conflicting temporalities that play their roles on an ever-increasing global scale. The extraction of surplus value in different geographical areas of the world is a good exemplification of this process. The investment of capital in the technological sector with the following extraction of relative surplus value in Western countries has become possible only through the simultaneous forced extraction of absolute surplus value that took place in other countries such as China or India, where the working day has reached the peak of 12 or more hours. Such a phenomenon occurs in the frame of the world market, that is, a system about which Marx began to think in the years of his first attempt to write Capital, as the following passage from a letter he wrote to Engels on the 8th of October, 1858 witnesses, quote, the proper task of bourgeois society is the creation of the world market, at least in outline, and the production based on that market. Since the world is round, the colonization of California and Australia and the opening up of China and Japan would seem to have completed this process, end quote. Marx, 1858. Plural spaces mean plural temporalities as well. Plural temporalities that, from the point of view of capital, need to be synchronized with the temporalities of an ever-increasing production and realization of surplus value that take place on the world market. Maybe the reflections of the late Marx must be contextualized within this wide conceptual constellation. From the ethnological notebooks to the preface to the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, going through the letter to Ferenc Sulich and its drafts. Footnote. For a presentation of the late Marx's writings about Russia, 1882 preface to the Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, the letter to Ferenc Sulich, and the letter to the editorial board of Otechestvenia Zabisky. See Shannon, 1983. For a deeper and historically wider examination of the Marxian writings about non-capitalist societies, see Anderson, 2010. It's probably Kevin B. Anderson's Marx at the Margins book. In these works, beyond some important In these works, beyond some important reflections on the conditions of possibility of a communist revolution, we can find some interesting considerations about the limit of the Eurocentric historical philosophical Weltanschauung and a deep critique of its theoretical framework based on a linear, teleological, and deterministic idea of progress. In this regard, it is worth quoting a passage from a letter Marx wrote to the Russian newspaper Otechestvenia Zabisky in November 1877. Here, in a few lines, Marx criticizes those interpreters who want to see in the pages dedicated to primitive accumulation a, quote, philosophy of history, end quote, aimed at foreseeing the future of every country according to prearranged evolutionary patterns. Quote, the chapter of Capital, the book, on primitive accumulation claims no more than to trace the path which, in Western Europe, the capitalist economic order emerged from the womb of the feudal economic order. It therefore presents the historical movement which, by divorcing the producers from their means of production, converted the former into wage laborers, proletarians in the modern sense of the word, and the owners of the latter into capitalists. End quote. Marx. Section 4. Primitive accumulation and the logical reproduction of capital. The systematic and structural role played by primitive accumulation represents a pivotal articulation in the explanation of some economic, social, and political phenomena typical of capitalism. But if we try to stay within the more restricted borders of the critique of political economy, it will be necessary to take an additional step and go deeper. If the project of the critique of political economy is to be understood, as Marx writes to Ferdinand Lassalle, as a, quote, critique of economic categories, if you like, a critical expose of the system of the bourgeois economy, end quote, as, quote, at once an expose and by the same token a critique of the system, end quote, Marx, 1858, then it should be clear that our interpretation of primitive accumulation is not accomplished, since this category has not yet been explained on the basis of the inner genesis of the categories of the whole system. I'm sorry, there's a footnote here, and I'm trying to see if I already read the passage that I need to read or if it's in. Okay, I haven't gotten there yet. To put it a different way, the object of the book, Capital, is not capitalism as a historical and particular phenomenon, but capital as a determined abstraction. The critique of capital consists in an exposition that is logically guided by, quote, the correct observation and deduction, end quote, Marx, 1857-58. Of the laws constituting social relations, which show themselves in a fetishized way, on the one side, in political economy, on the other, in society. Therefore, the critique of political economy, with its articulation between the method of inquiry, Forschungsweise, and the method of presentation, Darstellungsweise, need to be interpreted as a system with its own structural laws whose synchronic validity relates to a diachronically constituted matter. Footnote. Of course, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The form of presentation has to appropriate the material in detail to... This is a quote. Quote, of course, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of inquiry. The latter has to appropriate the material in detail, to analyze its different forms of development, to trace out the material's inner connection. Only after this work is done can the actual movement be adequately described. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is ideally reflected, as in a mirror, then it may appear as if we had before us a mere a priori construction. End footnote. Such a scientific model is not a static one. On the contrary, as the Italian Marxist philosopher Cesare Luperini has also highlighted, the formal genetic construction of capital would not be possible without the integration of historical genetic data in specific moments of the exposition. It says Cesare Luperini lived from 1909 to 1993 and was an Italian philosopher, historian of philosophy, and politician. In the footnote it says C. Luperini, 1975. Back to the text. Primitive accumulation as a systematic category of the critique of political economy has a hybrid nature. It is located between the historical genetic and the formal genetic moments. Footnote. In this sense, we could say that in these pages, Marx gives us a hint of the tension existing between morphology and chronology in the realm of historiographical reconstruction. In the horizon of the critique of political economy, the historical dimension cannot be represented as a sequence of events. Instead, it is a montage that requires the mediation of the formal determination of the categories implied by the systematic reproduction of the dominant mode of production. Hence, it is only after having identified the logic specific to the capitalist mode of production that we can talk about its specific temporalities and finally land in the domain of historiography. The conceptual reproduction of the capitalist society is the condition for the morphological analysis of its structural dynamics and its historical becoming and presuppositions. In this theoretical framework, we can see the anti-historicist nature of the Marxian critique. History is not something we can presuppose, but something we have to explain in history's specific forms of constitution and becoming. This is the point where the critique of political economy can make its contribution to the foundation of a critical historiography. End footnote. In the case of historical genetic, I'm going to reread the last sentence to contextualize the sentence after that. Primitive accumulation as a systematic category of the critique of political economy as a hybrid nature. It is located between the historical genetic and the formal genetic moments. In the first case, it shows the presuppositions of the historical genesis of capitalistic relations. In the latter, it defines that, quote, it is in fact this divorce between the conditions of labor on the one hand and the producers on the other that forms the concept, Begriff of capital, end quote. From this latter perspective, primitive accumulation is, then, the category that sets the conditions for the reproduction of the concept of capital itself. In this sense, we can maybe explain the reason for its position at the end of that circular exposition that characterizes Capital Volume 1. That is, primitive accumulation is the necessary condition for commodity and money to assume their capitalistic form. Those scholars who, like David Harvey, for example, consider primitive accumulation not only for its systematic character in the capitalistic accumulation, but also as a strategy consciously employed by the ruling class, run the risk of ignoring primitive accumulation's essential role in the reproduction of the capitalistic fetish. They describe capitalist reality, but they do not inquire about its conceptual constitution. In so doing, they lose the theoretical constitution of capital as a determined abstraction. The fetish character of commodities finds its first presupposition in the separation between the capitalist as a, quote, personification, end quote, of capital on the one side, and the worker selling his labor power on the other. Quote, the whole mystery of commodities, all the magic and necromancy that surround the products of labor, end quote, Marx, 1867, is built over this particular social relation. This, quote, bewitched, distorted, and upside-down world haunted by Monsieur le Capital and Madame le Terre, who are at the same time social characters and mere things, end quote. Marx, 1894, assuming that's Capital Volume 3, is founded on a perpetual separation process, which is achieved through primitive accumulation. Its importance is tangible even in the political domain, since the reproduction on a, quote, expanded scale, end quote, Marx, of the separation between the subjective and objective conditions of production represents an element of tension that animates class struggle. Proceeding in this direction, Marx has managed to radically demystify the nature of the bourgeois social relations to show the actual division that makes them effectual. Capital needs to perpetually reproduce its own presuppositions. Capital needs to keep the workers away from the possession of the conditions of production. Capital needs to renovate capital's, quote, eternal laws of nature, end quote, whose genesis is then removed in the result, assumed as an isolated fact, of a social relation that assumes the form of a relation between things. That is why, as Werner Bonafelt has written, primitive accumulation is, quote, the presupposition of capital and the result of capital's reproduction. In short, primitive accumulation is the social constitution of capitalist social relations, end quote. Bonafelt. Footnote. Bonafelt has given a synchronic interpretation of primitive accumulation starting from the different perspectives. See Bonafelt 1988 and Bonafelt 2011. End footnote. This is an essential feature to distinguish political economy from political economy's critique. The critique of political economy, as Max Horkheimer states, quote, does not labor in the service of an existing reality, but only gives voice to the mystery of that reality, end quote, and makes a contribution for that existing reality's removal with an unscrupulous praxis aimed at the transformation of the social totality. The critique of political economy is a critique which is able to tear up the fetishistic veil that masks the exploitation upon which capitalist reproduction is founded. Marx's critical apparatus can guide us in this comeback from the result to the genesis. In such, quote, anamnesis of the genesis, end quote, primitive accumulation, as we have seen, can play a crucial role. Footnote. See Adorno, 1965, for an interpretation of Adorno's anamnesis of Adorno's, quote, anamnesis of the Genesis, end quote, and of anamnesis of the Genesis relation to the Marxian critique of political economy. See Rodolfo Riva, 2013, and Bellafiore and Rodolfo Riva, 2015. I just read a piece by Rodolfo Riva last night that's from this same volume, and which Riva co-edited with Bellafiore, two thinkers who I respect a lot. Even though I know Bellafiore way more. Okay, end footnote. Where are we? Marx's critical apparatus sheds a light on the ever-renewing constitution of the capitalist social relations, the destiny then of this perpetual reproduction of the presuppositions of capital, a reproduction that will always come back to weigh on the proletarian's back as the toil of Sisyphus, will be decided on the grounds of class struggle. Okay, that's the end. And I'm going to read the references to the degree that I can, because some of these are not going to be in English. For instance, this first one by Adorno is not in English. So Adorno, Samir Amin's Accumulation, 1974 book, Accumulation on a World Scale, A Critique of the Theory of Underdevelopment. Kevin B. Anderson's 2010 Marx at the Margins, T.H. Ashton and C.H.E. Philpin. It's 1987 volume, The Brenner Debate, Agrarian Class Structure and Economic Development in Pre-Industrial Europe. Etienne Balibar, Reflections on Gewalt, published in Historical Materialism, 2009. Bellafiore and Rodolfi Riva, The Neue Marx Lectura, Putting the Critique of Political Economy Back into the Critique of Society. Daniel Ben Said's 2002 Marx for Our Times, Adventures and Misadventures of a Critique. Werner Bonefeld, 1988, The Class Struggle and the Permanence of Primitive Accumulation. Werner Bonefeld, 2001, The Permanence of Primitive Accumulation, Commodity Fetishism and Social Constitution, from The Commoner, 2. It seems like it's accessed for free online. Werner Bonefeld, 2011's Primitive Accumulation and Capitalist Accumulation, Notes on Social Constitution and Expropriation, published in Science and Society. A piece by M.L. Calabi in what I believe is Italian. Maurice Dobbs, 1946, The Studies in Development of Capitalism. Engels' Letter to Marx, 24th of August, 1852. David Harvey's 2003 New Imperialism, David Harvey's 2006 Spaces of Global Capitalism Towards a Theory of Uneven Geographical Development, David Harvey 2010 A Companion to Marx's Capital, David Harvey's 2014 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, David Harvey's Marx, Capital and the Madness of Economic Reason, published in 2017, R.H. Hilton's 1978 edited volume, The Transition from Feudalism to Capitalism, Max Horkheimer, Traditional and Critical Theory, Cesar Luperini, Reality and Historicity, Economy and Dialectics in Marxism. Should read that. Didn't think that would be in English. Rosa Luxemburg's 1913, The Accumulation of Capital, Marx's 1853, Peace, Revolution in China and Europe, Marx's Grundrisse. Yeah, when I said, oh, that's probably Grundrisse, 1857 to 58, that was what it was. A letter to Engels, 8th of October, 1858. Letter to Ferdinand Nassau, 22nd of February, 1858. Capital, A Critique of Political Economy. A letter to the editorial board of Otechets Venya Zabisky. In Theodore Shannon's edited volume, Late Marx and the Russian Road, Late Marx and the, quote, Peripheries of Capitalism, end quote, published by Monthly Review Press. Capital, A Critique of Political Economy, Volume 3. Yeah, when I said 1894 before, that was right. So, so Capital 1894 is when, 1894 is when Friedrich Engels completed Marx's Capital, Volume 3. Ellen Makeson's Wood, The Origin of Capitalism, A Longer View, on this channel. S.S. Prauer's 1976 Karl Marx and the World Literature. Tomasa Rodolfi Riva, who I said is wrote the piece about Neue Marx Lectura that's on this channel. He's it has a piece here, but it's in Italian. Theodore Shannon, edited volume, Late Marx and the Russian Road, Late Marx and the, quote, Peripheries of Capitalism. Massimiliano Tamba's article, 2009, Another Kind of Gewalt, Beyond Law, Rereading Walter Benjamin, and Massimiliano Tamba's 2012 book, Marx's Temporalities.